Thank you so much for being here for today's lunch program. When we first announced this program a couple of months ago, Christine, our scholar in resident, proposed this topic. We jumped at it. And in fact, it was supposed to take place, I think a few months ago, and a lot has changed. Some of the speakers couldn't make it. So Christine was able to reconstitute this program for today. And the topic, of course, you are all here to learn about the BRICS and the US dollar. And we're really delighted to have this wonderful, impressive panel of speakers for today's program. And in fact, the topic has become even more relevant than when we first scheduled it a few months ago. So I hope you are ready for your questions and for a great discussion. And I'm very grateful to Christine Lowe, our scholar in resident, for suggesting this topic and really working on it and working with our team, Holly Smith there. Thank you, Holly, for we have one business and policy program person, and that's Holly. And thank you, Holly, and thank you, Christine, for putting this program together with all the variations and all the changes. But we're going to be talking about this really interesting topic today. So I think some of you also have asked me about tomorrow's lunch. And that program really came about we heard last Friday from the speaker that he has a trip to Hong Kong and whether we would like to have a chat with him with a small group. And so the talk tomorrow is The View from Washington, Trump's Trade and Investment and Foreign Policies. And I figure if you're interested in the topic today, you might be interested in this topic tomorrow. And the speaker will be Francisco Sanchez. Although he's a partner at Holland and Knight based in DC, he was former Undersecretary of Commerce and Investment under the Obama administration. So Francesco has graciously offered his time. And he wanted a smaller group, so that he could have intimate discussion and so really hear from the audience. So that's why we limit it to our President's Circle and corporate members. So if you're not a President Circle member and corporate member, there is a chance we can get you in because we do right now have about 20 people signed up, and we're going to limit it to about 25 people. So if you are interested, give us a card, myself or Holly in the back. We will try to get you in. The lunch will be not as sumptuous as today. You will have a 3-course lunch, and tomorrow will be a brown bag sandwich from Pret. So just be warned. But it's the topic, not the food for tomorrow. So those of you who are interested. And I also want to use this opportunity to encourage you to become President's Circle or corporate members, not just because it's a higher level of membership and it's more money for Asia Society, not at all. With all the changes around the world and the kind of speakers that are approaching us these days, sometimes with very short notice, like in the case of Francesco, in some time, the speakers really want a smaller, intimate, off-the-record discussion. Next week, we're going to have a wonderful speaker from Iran. Puya has spoken to us before, and Puya is a professor, University of Tehran. He's been there for about 10 years. And with speakers like that, sometimes they really want a smaller, off-the-record, intimate discussions. So that's another reason we kind of limit, our President's Circle and corporate member get first div at it. So, and there's going to be more of these type of, I have a feeling, with all the uncertainties around the world, and also the importance of Hong Kong. I think we are going to get speakers like this, and they love coming to speak for Asia Society. And one of the reasons is because we have the diversity of members that we have. And we've had that kind of diversity of members for the last 35 years. I think Mark Michelson, you can attest to that. You've been a member from almost day one from 1990. So, this year we're celebrating our 35th anniversary. We were founded in 1990, and we were founded to be the connector, to be an international center. And in fact, today, when reading the paper, the headline, Hong Kong, the city's role as a gateway to the rest of the world, quote unquote, irreplaceable, says the MPC. And I'll quote, Hong Kong and Macau have been important windows for our countries opening up. They have unique positions and make significant contribution in more than 40 years of reform and opening up. Their roles are irreplaceable. And with that is a reminder that Asia Society has been there for the last 35 years, been that part of the world, being that kind of connector. So your support is very much needed. And thank you all for being here. And also another thing that not just the business and policy programs, that is how we were built in 1990. Most of the program before this center was opened in 2012 was mostly a business and policy program. But since then, the arts and cultural sector here in Hong Kong has grown. And because of our role in the arts and cultural space, this year we will be a cultural partner at Art Basel. We haven't done that in a while. We will no longer be, we will have a booth. And sometime organizations like Art Basel, Hong Kong, will offer our members special VIP access because they know our members are like you. So again, membership has its privileges, and so you will know, I think Max and other knows who are involved in the arts and cultural sector, this dynamic, this month is Art Month, and we are working on not one, not two, 3 exhibition openings. And you will ask, where are we going to put the exhibition opening? Three exhibitions. One will be in the Chantal Miller Gallery. That exhibition, we're going to be honoring a really interesting woman artist. And then the second show will be an outdoor sculpture. And then the third pop-up exhibition will take place in our Li Kuo Wei and Credit Suisse room. So that's really the kind of role that Asia Society Hong Kong has been able to play this last 12, 13 years in the art space. So again, I ask for your support, so please. And I think with that, I'm going to have you enjoy your lunch and come back. And if those of you, again, who are interested in tomorrow's lunch program, see me or see Holly and my program colleagues, Mia and others in the back. We'll be happy to include you if we can. And because it'll be today, the discussion will be very interesting, no doubt, because I know Christine will do a great job, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Doug, Alicia, Heiwai, and Christine shortly after 1. And so please enjoy your lunch, and I look forward to seeing you at future Asia Society Hong Kong programs, and somewhere at the Art Basel, Art Central, wherever. Have a great month, and thank you so much.
If I can invite the panelists to make their way up here slowly. I just want to share a little bit of background with all of you. About a month or so ago, when we started to plan an event, we were, of course, interested in the dollar, what will happen to the dollar. We were thinking about BRICS and ASEAN and, all these groups that are forming. We were talking about is it going to be a bilateral world, US and China? Is it going to be a multipolar world? And then, of course, about BRICS. But I think a few weeks later, coming to today, we're not quite sure that the blurb that we wrote to attract you to come here is absolutely relevant anymore, because things are just moving ahead so quickly. So we will discuss, of course, the dollar, what we think will happen. Is it going to be a settlement mechanism for the world? But as we go into the topic today, this morning I had something I needed to focus on, so I couldn't quite listen to the news. But I don't know whether you're like me, because things are happening literally by the hour. If you shut yourself down for a morning, there may be some surprising news that has happened that will change your world. And as we were gossiping before sitting down for this formal session, we thought that actually if you have any corporate plans or industry plans, you just might have to revise them totally in terms of what's happening. So I'm going to sit down now, we'll start talking, and we will have time later on for your Q&A. And knowing quite a number of you sitting in the audience, we know you are also extremely conversant on topics related to today. I think you know the speakers, but I'll just say thank you so much, Alicia, for coming. Alicia is with Natixis, a French investment bank, and she is the chief economist for the Asia-Pacific region. And on her right is Douglas, and Douglas is a lawyer with the Hong Kong University. And on my left is Heiwai Tang, who's also with Hong Kong University and a noted economist. So perhaps just to bring us to the same moment, where we are today, this rapid changing, tariffs every day, more and more people, can each of you just share with us where you think it all started? Alicia, let me start with you.
Okay, so hello everybody. I just feel really, I don't know, I can't even think of the adjective, which starts really poorly because you're supposed to, be sitting here to listen to us. But first of all, I know many of you, and you're not only conversant, but you probably could sit here and, and tell us what to think, and we would still not agree because this is so complex. But having said that, I think where we stand, so pre-Trump, we have an AI revolution, mostly in the US, huge productivity shock, positive, supply, so productivity shock, meaning good news for inflation, good news, for growth, good news. So Trump comes and, well, of course there was US-China strategic competition, Europe trying to figure which side to, we know which side, but how to de-risk the other and still be gentle. Kind of that was, and China self-sufficient. That was the world, while moving up the ladder, knowing very well that this AI revolution is essential for China as it is for the rest of the world. So that was it. Trump comes in, and I really feel like this is not only about tariffs. We could talk about tariffs, but I don't think that's the key issue here. I know that Chinese economists tend to say, well, we're ready for tariffs. This is not, I don't mean to say this is not a problem. I wouldn't go so far. But I actually think that there are other things that are much more important happening. And since this is the title of the conversation, de-dollarization, I think this is a big thing that I'm not saying is happening, but could happen. The main reason why this could happen, frankly speaking, and with all due respect to Hong Kong as a major R&B offshore center, not saying that this is not relevant, but it is very hard for a currency, certainly not a convertible currency, but even if it were to just jump and become the reserve currency of the world. The problem is who holds the reserve currency of the world and the policies that the US is now entertaining. I wouldn't say carrying out, entertaining. It is not an entertainment what the US is flirting with, such as the Mar-a-Lago Accord or the Mar-a-Lago strategy. Yeah, I mean, coming up with ideas such as, bring your bonds, your US treasuries, I swap them for much longer duration. And why not even a lower yield? Take it or leave it. I'm the US administration, and I hold the reserve currency. I mean, that doesn't sound like a very positive thing to do if you hold the reserve currency and you have a huge fiscal and current account deficit. Yeah, you actually need people to hold your currency, which is why you have a reserve currency to start. Yeah, you need to owe money to cross-border to actually have that. But once you have it, you can't just behave as you could impose the use of that currency. Yeah, and I think that is where things are starting to shake, in my view. There's no alternative. I hear you. If you look at the U.S. holdings, if you look at SWIFT data, actually since Ukraine, U.S. holdings, international holdings have come down, not up. So you may say, and RMB is actually coming down from a hype since the invasion of Ukraine, but it's coming down again. So there seems to be no alternative. But this is when the most daring thing, I wanted to say crazy, but I leave it there, most daring things can be done because you think there is no alternative. So that's why I think it's very dangerous that there is no alternative because there might be an alternative, and I leave it there.
All right, you mentioned the Mar-a-Lago, and Doug, would you start there too?
I agree with Alicia's analysis, and I want to put a bit in perspective. And I think first, thanks to Alice and the Asia Society and you, Christine, for putting this together. It's one of my favorite discussion topics over my entire career, really. If we look at international monetary arrangements, it's something that if we think about periods of globalization, cross-border trade throughout human history, you really need something that people can agree to accept in cross-border transactions. And over time, we've seen a variety of different choices. And so that's point one, is that it is necessary to have something to make transactions on a cross-border basis easier. That can change periodically. The second point is if we think about this period of the dollar as the dominant currency, I think we can look at this, one, from beginning at the end of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods period, where the dollar standard, the dollar is still tied to gold, with the rest of the world tied to the dollar. We then have this period from the early 1970s up to the present where we break that link between the dollar and other currencies and gold and move to a world of fiat currencies, of floating exchange rates. And in a world of floating exchange rates and fiat currencies, the way that these instruments, and particularly ideas of reserves, change quite dramatically. And coming out of this is the second point, which is that this entire period we have had continual complaints about the US dollar and its dominance. Now, if we think about the last 3 to 4 years, I would say that we've seen a change in direction. In other words, one aspect of a given monetary system's persistence is the idea that people are comfortable with it, it's easy to do, and you just keep using it, until something shifts, pushes. And I think we've had, over the past several years, 2 big shifts that have been taking place. The first has been, and let's frame that as three big shifts. The first has been an increase in size of a number of other economies. So that compared to the end of the Second World War, the US isn't the only economy, you've got several. Second has been technological evolution, which has made it easier to have technologies that make it easier not to rely just on one single instrument. And the third has been the Ukraine war and the geopolitical shift that really focused from the standpoint of sanctions and questions about the reliability of that instrument. And I think if we look at these 3 factors coming together, that is what is making the discussions on this topic today, and why every country that I go to today is trying to figure out ways to increase the use of its own currency in international transactions.
Heiwai, Alicia mentioned that as the reserve currency, the U.S. has responsibilities. But do you think that we've kind of gone into a state with what Douglas has shared with us, that those 3 things have kind of shifted our thinking about what to do?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I usually don't like to use the word that starts with DE. As a trade economist, I don't agree that we are going through a process of deglobalization. For the same reason, I don't think we are in a process of de-dollarization. And of course, it's a matter of definition. If you really want to use this word, then you should add the word gradual rather than sudden or abrupt. Because U.S. dollar as a foreign reserve currency, foreign exchange reserve currency, has been declining since 2000 very slowly. Right at the peak in 2000, 70% of the central bank's reserve is in U.S. dollars. Now it's around 55%. This is the first point. The second point is a lot of people quickly associate de-dollarization with RMB internationalization. There's almost no relationship between the two, especially after 2022, as Alicia mentioned. The share of RMB users in international transactions has been actually declining since 2022. Now it's around 3% of the total international transactions. But then there was a short period of time between 2016 to 2022 that the expansion of the use of RMB did lead to a little bit faster de-dollarization. There's a paper written by Barry Eckengren, published by the IMF Economic Review. He and his team explained that around a quarter of de-dollarization for that 5 or 6 years period is because of increased use of RMB. The third point I want to mention is if we were expecting that the RMB is going to be more commonly used, it's not going to happen until the central government or the PBOC all of a sudden started to significantly liberalize the capital account, right? So it's not going to happen soon. It's not going to happen, in my opinion, in the next 5 or 10 years. But if there's one party that has been helping other countries to use the RMB, I would say it's the U.S. government, right? Due to sanctions, tariffs, and the so-called China plus one strategies adopted by multinational firms, including Chinese companies themselves, now you have more export from China to many global South countries in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. The reason why I said this is the area that the Chinese authorities have been most effective in increasing the use of RMB is actually through international trade. So for example, if we look at the share of RMB users in trade that involves China on one side, it has been increasing from 25% to over 30% in the last 5 years, right? So, if trade become increasingly more fragmented, which I think is going to be the case, then the use of RMB in trade invoicing is going to increase, right? So these three trends are what I think can clarify about the actual process of de-dollarization and the relationship between de-dollarization and RMB internationalization.
Well, that's very interesting for us to note that if we take out the D and just talk about currencies, and then we look at trade settlement between countries or amongst countries, if you're looking at BRICS, and if we don't link it to RMB internationalization, we see three very separate things. Now, each of those things have a tremendous impact on trade and commerce. So perhaps you'd like to comment on that?
So if our audience allows us, because this is nitty-gritty, and I'm sure your questions are going to be much broader, but let's go into the details of how a currency is used internationally. So first of all, you need somebody outside of your jurisdiction. So you need one leg, must be a non-resident. Because China has, of course, a lot of market power on, imports, say, copper imports. Of course, there's been a trend to increase trade settlements in RMB. As I said, this is coming down, and I think the risk of secondary sanctions did matter. This is the end of the Biden administration. So I'm not saying sanctions don't matter, they do, and people react to that. But of course, the long-term trend is, why bother? Maybe I can, I can go CIPS, China International Payment System, avoid, and so on and so forth. But still, we see that because of China's economic size, yes, there is like a natural process. That is trade settlements. However, and this is Europe, a lot of the other uses of an international currency have nothing to do with trade. Actually, that's the bulk of the transactions. If you look at actual settlements, trade is maybe 20%. The rest is financial transactions. That's where the dollar dominates big time. In fact, while the share of foreign reserves in central banks have come down to around 55%, the share of overall settlements in dollar has ballooned in the last few years, and that's logical because if you look at the stock market, it's dominated, global stock markets, US companies, bond issuance and US Treasury issuance, to my dismay, because this is more debt. But still, these are dollar transactions held by non-residents. So the dollar is actually more dominant than ever if you look at the whole picture. But that is, in a way, for me, you're looking at the cliff, yeah? Because you're so dominant, but you're taking policies that don't help that dominance. People are stuck until they aren't. So I think this is really what the Trump administration has in front that they have to be careful. I'm sorry, they are not being careful. So this is the irony, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of talk also about U.S. spending, and they have to raise bonds, they have to raise money to spend for the government. So, Douglas, what perspective would you like to share with us on this?
Yeah, so I think, and I think in looking at Heiwai and Alicia's points, I think when we think about the international use of a currency, we can really think of it from sort of three different angles. One is from the standpoint of trade, and this is one where particularly the bilateral trade dynamics make a great deal of difference. It's both imports and exports. That means the sort of usability of the money in a sort of two-way direction. And this has been, for the US dollar, it's been an important source of its sort of rise, but we've also seen this in other periods. The second is from the standpoint of its role in financing. And this is something where we have seen an increase in use of the RMB in certain circumstances, but the lack of convertibility poses a real issue. And the third has really been from this idea of reserves management. And this is where we have seen some development, but also economic factors and interest rates have a big play here. Now, from the standpoint of if we look at historical episodes of the end of major fiat currency cross-border usage, often it relates directly to issues around inflation. In other words, one aspect of being able to use a monetary instrument is the fact that you think of it as a store of value, which means that you have relatively low levels of inflation. And certainly if we think about the history of governments around the world, collapse of governments is often preceded by very high rates of inflation. And so this is one thing where very much I agree with Alicia from the standpoint of thinking about the U.S.'s position right now. There are very real risks from the standpoint of trying to overplay the position of having the currency that, given some of these other factors, the amount of work that has gone on around the world to make it easier to use other currencies in transactions means that the tipping point could happen much quicker than one might anticipate.
So let's leave RMB internationalization out of it, because as you said, Heiwai, it really ain't going to happen. But following on from what Doug and Alicia said, how do you see the world will look at the dollar?
Again, there is no better alternative, and they can continue to enjoy this privilege. So I remember when I was a grad student 20-something years ago, there is a paper with the title "Dark Matter." It's not a physics paper; it's actually an economics paper written by a famous economist called Ricardo Hausmann. So basically, he was trying to understand, why the U.S. was able to run so many years of current account deficit, accumulated so much debt, without any pressure on, the U.S. dollar. And the conclusion is, U.S. is the only country, in his opinion, that can run the Ponzi scheme without any consequence. So it is going to be the case until something bad happens, as Doug was, guessing. But I just don't see, as an economist, in the next 10 years or more, what would emerge to even threaten the dominant position of the U.S. dollar. So don't forget that, even though the U.S. was already the supreme economic power in the 70s, by the 70s, the most dominant international currency is actually the UK pound rather than the US dollar. So this sort of inertia to use the same currency that was the currency of the previous power will continue for a while. So if you like some sort of fun analysis done by Ray Dalio, in his book The Changing World Order, he had this sort of cycles of big power dynamics, and then he predicted that, which as an economist I don't fully agree, but it's fun to look at the graphs that the currency of the previous dominant power will continue for another 2 or 3 decades.
Well, I know you're all writing stuff, right? Publishing papers and writing op-eds, writing clients analysis. In this climate today, where literally we can go home after our lunch and there'll be something new being thrown out. So what sort of things are you writing? What sort of things are your client wanting to see? What questions are they asking you?
What about the Hong Kong dollar? Since we're sitting here, Hong Kong dollar, yeah? Look at this interesting fact, yeah? So Hong Kong is an amazing offshore center, offshore financial center, pegged to the pegged to the dollar, Hong Kong dollar, with the currency board, and rightly so, because this brings, you import credibility, still today, as you said, and at the same time, though, you're running the largest R&B center in the world. You start to run this, BIS no longer, but BIS bridge, and you bring local currencies, yeah, and you at the same time have to make sure that you keep the Hong Kong dollar in the band 1 percentage point only of, wow, difficult. I mean, it is obviously, I'm not arguing that this is not doable. It is doable. But if we think 20 years ahead, it is kind of, because we forgot about one important role of the international currency, which is actually what we call, basically is the official use. It's called pegging. I mean, pegging Saudi, pegging to the dollar, or pegging, I mean, most of the currencies in the world which are still pegged or managed are pegged to the dollar. There's a few exceptions in Europe, pegged to the euro because they want to or think of entering the euro or adopting the euro, but there are very few, yeah? There's no currency pegged to the RMB, is there? So, all of these things to say that the other aspect of what we're discussing is the rest of the world, yeah? The Gulf, Hong Kong. I mean, how do they approach this question? Because it's not only about holding dollars, which is, of course, I mean, as a reserve currency or clients holding dollars. No, it's about your exchange rate regime and everything that goes with it. So this question becomes even more important. That's what I was trying to say for Hong Kong or any other area of the world pegging to the reserve currency. And I think this is, of course, at the minute you talk about D, even if we take the word D, even if we talk about dollarization, once upon a time, people were talking about dollarization, yeah? Ecuador dollarized full. I mean, Ecuador doesn't have a currency. It doesn't issue, not even Hong Kong dollar to peg to a currency board. They just don't have a currency. Think about how you feel if you talk about de-dollarization, if you've abandoned your currency. So, this is very important because the minute you open this discussion, for some areas of the world, Hong Kong being one, I think not necessarily the most obvious, but because we're in Hong Kong, I want to mention, people start wondering, what is the consequence of our discussion for Hong Kong? What is the consequence for Saudi? What is the consequence for Ecuador? Maybe nobody in the room does look at that as a very important event, but I guess in the country they do. So that's the thing. People ask questions about this.
Well, you've kind of raised this sensitive issue about Hong Kong, and I'm not quite sure whether you're thinking, this is a good or a bad thing. So at the universities, at the law school, at the economic schools, are you writing, are you thinking about Hong Kong's position?
In the last week, I've been speaking for over 15 times about the most recent published Hong Kong government budget. So today, I have to erase all my analysis and start thinking about BRICS, so which is something that I enjoy more. But it's hard because there are so many, I would say, important issues that need to be addressed in this city. Without going beyond today's topic, let me talk about the U.S. Hong Kong dollar peg. I think it's extremely important for China, given that we are an RMB offshore center. It's also important for any IFC to have a stable currency. So it's not legitimate, or I would say right, to give up the peg in the near future, right? It's not in the interest of HKMA, it's not in the interest of PBOC. But because now the Hong Kong economy has a very different cycle of the United States, so the hard peg with the US dollar actually has created a lot of real economic problems, right? The high interest rate had, created, a lot of property market downturn trends, as well as, increasing the cost of capital, and more importantly, at the retail, wholesale, and food and beverage sectors, because of a strong dollar and the sluggish downward adjustment of prices. People start going to the Greater Bay Area, to Japan, to many other places in Asia to consume rather than spend the money here. So let me be a bit more politically incorrect by saying, 7.5 million people in Hong Kong are paying a high price to maintain Hong Kong as an IFC. It is the price that we need to pay, but it's a lot of pain.
How about you, Douglas?
Yeah, I think when I think about this, the framework and kind of goes to Heiwai's point about D. And I don't use deglobalization, de-dollarization, but the framework that I find myself applying in almost all of these contexts is multipolarity. We're in a world economy where you have a multipolar world economy. You have three major economies that are much bigger than the rest. You have, from the standpoint of political relationships, a much more, and I think increasingly from the start of this year, something that is less hegemonic and more multipolar going forward. But what does this have to do with this particular context? And I would say three areas that I tend to spend time on. The first is Hong Kong is an international financial center. This is what I've done over the past 25 years. So I'm always happy to talk about this subject. But the upside here is that from the standpoint of an increasingly multipolar world, Hong Kong's role as an international financial center for China as one of those major poles has only grown in importance. And so I think that is an important trajectory. And one aspect of that is the ability through systems like Enbridge and others to be able to deal with payments in a variety of different currencies from around the world. And I think that is central. The second is really from the standpoint of this regional point, and where I'm really seeing a dramatic acceleration in the context of efforts to use local currencies on an increased rate is in regions. Obviously, the EU moving to a single currency. If I think about ASEAN, Southeast Asia, working since the Asian financial crisis on increasing the use of domestic currencies. If I think about the Gulf, similar sorts of processes. Africa, and I think these are likely to continue. What becomes more challenging is when we're thinking about those sorts of global relationships as opposed to regional. And the final piece is really a technological point. And it's an interesting one because, of course, I've been sort of re-emphasizing this multipolar dynamic. But one thing that there's an interesting question to watch, and that is around a monetary and technological combination, which are called stablecoins. And there's a real view that the easy availability of US dollar stablecoins everywhere in the world may actually reinforce the position of the US dollar out of simple cost, convenience, efficiency. And so I think this is something very interesting to watch.
Well, obviously, you've raised the issue of technology, Enbridge, and so on. So can I just ask one more question before we open it up for the floor, because I think there are people who have comments or questions. What do you think Hong Kong should do? You've started to give a list, but I thought maybe each one of you can make a short comment about what would you advise the government to do in terms of Hong Kong as an IFC in this new world of multipolarity and where we are today. Maybe you can maybe do a clear list for us, and then we'll see what the other two say.
Yeah, and this is something that I actually think over the past several years, particularly in the financial space, the Hong Kong government, particularly the regulators, have been trying a sort of shotgun approach of trying everything. But I think some credit there, that they have been energetically trying everything they can think of. And some of that is starting to stick. And I think this focus from the standpoint of technology is important, from the standpoint of increasing the sorts of international relationships, and from the standpoint of building institutional frameworks, which takes us back to some of the BRICS discussions. These are very clear. But the key ones, the center of a financial center, is really four things. That is free movement of money, free movement of people, free movement of information, and a reasonably predictable legal system. And these, combined with the connection to one of these major economic poles, this is the core.
Heiwai?
I mean, I started feeling that, businesses are coming back to Hong Kong, may not be from the US, but from the rest of the world. So, Hong Kong as a whole needs to think about how to reposition itself as an international city in the region. So the traditional role as a gateway between China and the West, in particular the US, may not be sort of the focus for us in the next few years. So the question is, how can we play a role in facilitating, more flows between China and Southeast Asia, China and the Middle East? And the government has been talking a lot about this, but the knowledge gap is still huge, right? As a professor in university, I hope that we, university professors can play a role to at least get the students to come, organize events like this to first understand each other, second, build trust between each other, and finally, hopefully, this international city will have a new outlook.
So what you're really saying is, it's all very well saying these are our policies, but everybody has some responsibility to actually go and make it happen. And that is to connect people, businesses, networks, knowledge, and so on. Alicia, maybe a final word from you on this point before we open up?
So maybe I would say the following. If the global order doesn't change, I get it. Hong Kong needs to keep, open, capital account, rule of law, and all of that, fine. But there's also an opportunity from a different world, yeah? So we're heading towards a world where the U.S. Mar-a-Lago says, swap my bonds, take them, take it or leave it, basically. Oh, what kind of capital account convertibility is that? I mean, what kind of regime? Yeah, we're heading towards a very kind of different regime, I feel, in terms of even rule of law, to be frank, because that is, not necessarily voluntary arrangement, maybe, eventually. I mean, I don't know whether this is going to happen or how it is going to be finally carried out. But it's just the bell is ringing, yeah? We hear things that are not the usual financial globalization mantra that we learn on textbooks, put it this way. So if that is the case, what I think Hong Kong should be doing is to provide alternatives, yeah? Because at the end of the day, you have a massive stock market. People start doubting, you are a foreign company issuing in the US, or doing an IPO in the US. There are things that can happen to you, and this is not the first time, yeah? We went through that with Chinese companies in the US in Trump's first administration. And it doesn't have to be only Chinese companies. It could be any company. Yeah, it could be. So I think Hong Kong has this opportunity. Of course, it needs to keep the Hong Kong dollar. I can't agree more, because you don't want to, shake the shop before you open it. Yeah, you may as well open it by keeping the title and then attracting capital to Hong Kong. offering an alternative platform, just a platform. You don't need to offer a different currency. You just need to offer a different platform. And I think that is very powerful because people are looking around. Yeah, people are worried about, let's call it interference. Maybe there may be a more subtle word, but that's all I can think now. And I think Hong Kong has a role to play there. The beauty of this is that it doesn't have to be only China. Now, of course, the Hang Seng is very dominated by mainland names, which is no problem. But if you want to offer this alternative, you need to be more global. And I think that means anybody thinking that it needs an alternative. And by the way, Trump 2.0 clearly shows is anybody. It could be a Mexican company, it could be anybody. So, that offers a very, re-globalization kind of process for Hong Kong that I think in a way for reasons that are so natural. Yeah, China became so big, so Hong Kong accommodated China's size. But I think Trump 2.0 offers an alternative to become more re-globalized kind of your stock market, your bond issuance, because people will be looking for alternatives. Yeah.
I guess one of the concerns is what can they do to Hong Kong, right, to stop any of that happening. But before we go into that scary discussion, can I have a show of hands, people who might be interested to maybe comment, share your wisdom with us, or ask a question? There's a hand in front, please. 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Okay. Please.
Okay. So I think that if you generated a word cloud by telling people the topic is the BRICS and the US dollar, what word pops into your mind? I think there's a word that would be very large in this word cloud, and yet I haven't heard this word mentioned, maybe a little bit obliquely. The word is where did it go?
That happens.
Sanctions.
Sanctions. I mean, did you mean that Hong Kong could be sanctioned?
No,
and therefore cannot play that role?
I mean, any of the BRICS.
Yes.
And some are experiencing sanctions. There's a suggestion that Europe should fund the war in Ukraine by taking Russian assets. I don't know if they're dollar denominated or euro denominated or what. So I would think that many of the BRICS are concerned that they may be subjected to sanctions. So my question, I guess, is how does this relate to the question of dollar dominance? Are they intimately connected, or are they not necessarily the same question?
Heiwai, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, so I think the US government, I was talking about the Biden administration. I mean, this one I have no clue what they're going to do. But, if I look at the last 8 years, before January this year, they are fully aware of the impacts of sanctions on the US dollar. And for that reason, I never imagined that the US government is going to do something on the Hong Kong financial system. Because if they touch any of the IFC, which has huge dollar reserve, is going to hugely undermine the demand for the US dollar and therefore the dominance of it. So I think, the US authorities, including Trump today, should be quite careful about the consequence of if they're going too far in attacking big economies. So for that, for this reason, I am not seeing a high possibility that the U.S. government is going to sanction like a major SOE bank or a Hong Kong financial institution. But that said, actually we didn't spend much time talking about BRICS, which is half of the topic here. The emergence of BRICS is going to increase the demand for a common currency within the region. And Trump was aware that if it emerged, then it's going to threaten the US dollar a lot more than any of the existing currency that we have. So let's see whether it will happen. BRICS are obviously very careful about whether and when to launch it. And as a matter of fact, this year is there's supposed to be a transition in the leadership for the new development bank in Shanghai. The current president, the former president of Brazil, Dilma, has been the president of New Development Bank for 4 years already. It's supposed to be the turn for Russia. But I think the Russian government is fully aware of the consequence if they send a Russian to be the president of the New Development Bank. So they are playing this very carefully.
Any comment, please, Doug?
I'll make a quick point on sanctions because I think it's a significant one. It relates particularly to something that Alicia said earlier, and I did as well. I think if we look at some of this shift around 2022 to countries thinking about alternatives, one of the biggest drivers was the sanctions globally. And that's something that in many other comments you've seen a sort of recognition from the Trump administration that maybe that was actually a risk from the standpoint of the dollar. And so actually wanting to scale back sanctions in order to reinforce the business attractiveness of the dollar. But then it's interesting because you've also had exactly this comment on the BRICS currency of sanctions. And I think this takes us to Alicia's point about that risk that if one views an excess of sort of power as a result of something, one can take decisions that will actually have the opposite effect. So this is one where I think there's this interesting, as in so many other aspects of the Trump administration, there are very different views that have been expressed by the same people. But I think if we were to see a major increase in sanctions coming out of the US to a wider range of countries, that in all likelihood would accelerate moves to using alternative currencies.
The gentleman at the back? Yes.
Thanks for a very interesting and useful discussion. I'd like to challenge a little bit, if I may, the statement that lots of countries peg their currencies to the dollar, but no countries peg their currency to the RMB. Is that still true today, or could you make the case that in the last few years, China has been saying to other large economies, particularly in Asia, keep your currency stable against the RMB, and then we'll keep the RMB stable against the dollar? And I'm thinking particularly of the shakeout that happened in the Japanese yen at the back end of last year. I think it was September or October. When the dust settled, it seemed it was more to do with a reaction to PBOC actions rather than Fed actions.
Alicia?
Yeah, if I may say something on sanctions, just very briefly, and then, so first of all, I think if I had to order the importance of 3 key factors for potential de-dollarization, or at least slow de-dollarization trends, US, that would be, I could repeat it many, many times, it always comes from within. Then private currencies, but there is very tricky because it's US dominated. So, you know, you could argue, yeah, you know, crypto or, but the reality is that the dominance comes from stable coins already, and that is US. So I would say US, meaning the government, what the government does, the economy, inflation, kind of forced debt restructuring or semi-forced, that is key. Sanctions, for me, comes even after the private currencies. Because if you look actually at the dollar SWIFT data on the dollar settlements, it only increased since the war in Ukraine. It was the euro to lose. And why? Because that eventually there's no way around. Yes, you can do a little bit of trade, that's fine, but that's so little compared to actual global transactions. So for me, the BRICS threat, I'm sorry to say, is at the current juncture not credible, in my view. There's many other types of threats BRICS can come forward, maybe, you know, a big free trade arrangement, investment, you name it. But the currency, I think, their currencies, many are not even convertible. I mean, they don't it is, I don't know why they started with the currency. I get it, they're upset about sanctions, but I'm not sure they are ready to make credible threat to the dollar. That's my take. On the other one, I think, yes, I hear you, but frankly, I think the yen is a yen story, in my view, meaning BOJ had to get out of this ultra lax, ultra actually negative interest rates and then move out, and a lot of what happened, that weak currency, was basically expectations of an appreciation. I mean, this is, we economists call it uncovered interest rate parity, sorry for the jargon, but it basically was showing that rates would go up and then that the currency would appreciate. I think it's mostly, if you ask me which currencies are unofficially pegged to the RMB in Asia, you have to go to Cambodia. I mean, not any closer. Not even the Taiwan dollar or the Vietnamese dong is as, maybe the Vietnamese dong would be the next, but it's very far from a peg to the Hong Kong dollar officially, yeah? That you need to keep your reserves, to keep your monetary base. There's no such thing, not a single one, that can officially, compare to a peg to the dollar today. But you're right, it may happen in the future, and that would be a big blow to the dollar, because the official use is extremely important in terms of credibility. Why would you peg to the RMB? Because you are thinking price stability. You are keeping the value of your currency more than if you peg to the dollar. And I don't think that is yet a reality. If you think about, prospects for RMB, people are worried about additional depreciation. I mean, it's not clear that you would peg to a currency that is yet uncertain, let alone non-convertible, because you need to intervene in the market to keep the currency at that level, and you can't. The market is not liquid enough. This is another problem. So I think there's a long way to go, in my view, to officially peg to the RMB.
Have a view on this?
Well, nothing much to add. Given that RMB is not fully convertible in open market, it's very hard to be an anchor currency.
I think the trade settlement is possible, right, between countries where they use the RMB more. But I think as a reserve currency, probably not. A question in front, please.
Thanks. Fascinating. I was going to ask about the Hong Kong dollar, but I think you've already answered it, and I agree with what you said. Anyway, I just would add one thing before I ask a question. Is in terms of attributes of an international financial center, I'd add relatively free flow of information. And maybe you didn't mention that, but you may know the Hong Kong government surveys companies, organizations that have parents outside of Hong Kong, including mainland companies and others, and also counts them. But number one is what the attributes of Hong Kong is always the low and simple tax system. Number two is always the free flow of information for both mainland companies and international companies and organizations. So just wanted to add that. BRICS. I teach now 3 courses at CUHK. That's my side job. And one of the courses, International Finance and Trade Policy. And my students are mostly mainlanders. And increasingly, the role of the U.S. dollar has been the center of attention. But we also talk about BRICS. And of course, BRICS has expanded recently. And you mentioned the role. But BRICS is a very disparate organization. It was, even in its original formation, one of the key players is not in that photo, India, but India and China are certainly dominant economically. Now that it has Ethiopia, Iran, and Egypt, do you think it has a role to play, not only effective role to play, not only vis-a-vis the dollar, but in other areas? Or is it too disjointed at this point to really play an important role? I don't know the answer to that, but just wonder what your thoughts are.
Heiwai?
Well, I used to think that BRICS is just an acronym created by some JP Morgan economist, but now it became actually it actually became more and more relevant because the U.S. government, allow me to be frank, is withdrawing from a lot of multilateral activities and organizations. So the original 5 countries, now altogether 10, including Indonesia, by the way, are composed of countries that have the group itself is like, self-sufficiency in production, close to self-sufficiency in technology. And you may argue, U.S. is still, a only country that can produce the most advanced GPU. Again, it's a matter of time that China may be able to catch up in producing the cutting-edge semicon as well. Energy, food, etc. Right? So you're absolutely right that the most important economic powers are still China and India. But with Brazil providing food, Russia providing energy, and Indonesia providing demand at some point, it's become a very important coalition of countries that may be a very effective hedge against any kind of geopolitical shocks coming from the U.S.
Two quick points. One, freedom of information is one of my four. It's absolutely central, and I think it's one that, particularly if we think of Hong Kong versus the mainland, it's one of the strongest differentiators. And so I think that's huge. From the standpoint of BRICS, completely agree with Heiwai's analysis. I would flag one other point which has been moving at some pace, as many other things, over the past several months, and that had been, up until just a couple of months ago, one could say that the G20 was operating with some level of effectiveness at, if not necessarily an economic cooperation level, at least from the standpoint of financial affairs. It was reasonably effective. But you may be seeing a really dramatic pullback by the US from that. And if we were to see this continue, that would be very significant from the standpoint of other organizations.
Yeah, BRICS. I would like to see whether they would pull together agro, energy. I mean, not yet. I mean, let's face it. But yes, maybe in the future. But there's a crack. There's a crack in the BRICS, and that is the I. That is India. India. So this is the way I Belt and Road Initiative. India never in. Highly critical of the Belt and Road Initiative. Hub and spoke. I'm not at, I'm at your level. Of course, not really, but, that this is India's aspirations. BRICS come and India feels they might be at the level. Yeah, only 4 members and, actually, I mean, the fact that there is rotation of presidents at the, that was not necessarily clear at the beginning when this bank was created because the capital, India's paid in capital and China is the same. It's the same, 40 billion, I think. So, India is like, wait a minute, I thought we were equals. And then you expand this thing, and I'm no longer equal. It looks increasingly like Hub and spoke. You are at the head of the table, and I'm sitting. So that crack could crack anytime. The good news for the BRICS is that Kazan, there was this realignment, rapprochement, if you want, of India, Modi, Xi, and then there's been additional discussions, maybe even direct flights, which is not good news for Hong Kong, by the way, because there's a lot of people coming yet just to fly to India. But the point is, everybody knows this is just, it is very, how would I say, very, very fragile. So India holds the key. Because if you have this big country moving out eventually, what kind of... So this is why I think the BRICS is highly fragile still today because of this big question mark. And let's not forget, India thinks they are the leaders of the Global South. And China is not even part of the Global South. That's how they read. So, when you look at that, it's like, where are we? Are you all in the BRICS or am I talking about, a different group of countries? So this is why I still think there's a long way to go for the BRICS to really play that kind of stabilizing role among themselves. They need to trust each other first, yeah? They need to trust each other first. The sooner they grow, the faster they grow, the harder it will be, because it will be very heterogeneous. Iran and Saudi, Saudi is thinking, but it's like, wait a minute, Iran is in. So, I would say I would have actually, of course I can't make that decision, but I would have kept the BRICS smaller, because then you can really play that. But this is too fast to make it a real alternative economic power.
Any other questions? Great. Can I ask all three of you to ask your questions all in one go so that we can fit it in as quickly as possible before we have to close? Please.
So I got the mic.
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you for the sharing. I like the dark matter things because 5% is atoms, 95% is dark matters and dark energy, which is unknown. But that's the beauty part of the unknown astronomy. So anyway, so my question is talking about the technology because BRICS starts with Brazil. So to this year we have the COP30 at Brazil. So they have the most nature capitals. So my question is, how can we link, like just now you mentioned using the BRICS Pay, EU Pay as trade settlement, that's possible. But then for reserve, what if we have nature as the reserve? And then we have because we joined the Nature-Based Solution Conference, Christine is one of the moderators as well. There's a lot of dialogue on blended financing. So I don't know, it's just a thought, is it possible we make BRICS countries not just to develop to ruin the nature, but at the same time use blended financing to protect the nature so that we can have the nature reserve at these countries? I don't know. So it's just a questions to share the thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
A question on the US dollar RMB relationship. My understanding is that the US wants to do to China what it did to Japan in 1985. So US is going to ask RMB revaluation of 40%. China is going to say no. So US is going to ask increase Chinese salaries by 40% to create domestic demand. China is going to say no. So the US is going to say I increase tithes by 40%. And China is going to say, I keep my prices, inflation is going to blow up in the US, and there's going to be a huge fixed income crash in the US. So both camps at this stage think they're winning, which is a recipe for war. So how do we avoid monetary war?
Thank you. Alex in front. Thank you.
I just wanted to just have a very quick follow-up to Mike's question and what Alicia was talking about, the sort of tensions between the BRICS as an economic grouping and a political grouping, because it seems to me that it's becoming a sort of non-aligned group for the new generation, which I think was being led by India. And I wonder if it's more appropriate at this point to look at it as that, as opposed to a real economic bloc.
Good. Well, I'll let each of you to pick the bits of the questions that you would like to answer. Maybe Alicia.
Well, first, I fully agree. I think they might even change the name. It sounds because, they don't have enough acronyms left for all of the countries that are joining. So that's a good suggestion. On the monetary war, I feel like, gosh, because the Mar-a-Lago that we're hearing now used to be another Mar-a-Lago that I wrote about, which is exactly this. Mar-a-Lago at the beginning was a new Plaza Accord, meaning the U.S. forces China to revalue, and that reduces the current account deficit, U.S. current account deficit, and with China and la la la. And they forgot about it. They suddenly used the same name, Mar-a-Lago, for something totally different, which for me is like, do they still care about this idea? I just can't figure, because it seems to have been blown away by this swap of U.S. treasuries, which for me is much more dangerous, frankly. Now, when I wrote this thing, I actually, it's an FT piece. I remember I said, China will not accept this, your point. China will not accept a revaluation of the currency because China has literally $1 trillion in trade surplus. So, it is so important for China today to keep that. And a revaluation hits China with any other trading partner. Yeah, it's not only with the US. Tariffs hit China with the US, but they can export through Vietnam, you name it. But if they revalue the currency 40%, that is a huge shock for China. So my sense is they're not going to take that. And what that means is that tariffs are already, 20%. They would probably increase further. These are the only tariffs that Trump is not saying, I might rethink the tariffs like Canada or Mexico. They seem to be much more stable to China's dismay. So I do think they're going tariff on China. But if you read, last week's Trump administration set of measures on investment, that is big also. So really like a lot of constraints for China to invest in the US, more export controls coming. I mean, the tech containment plus investment containment will add to the tariff containment in the light of no agreement on a Plaza Accord number 2 or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
I want to talk about India. I think I started seeing some sign of optimism between China and India. I've been getting a lot of invitations from different Indian organizations to go to India to speak about what's going on in China, partly because it is very hard for Chinese scholars to go to India. Either their universities don't encourage them to do it, or they couldn't get a visa in India. So the demand for knowledge about China has increased, which is usually the first sign of positive changes. Someone told me about potentially sort of insider conversation between Musk and Modi in Washington, D.C. Without revealing too much information, Musk actually requested Modi to potentially lower tariffs against China because he wanted to invest in India, building Tesla factories, etc. If that's the case, and Modi is convinced by Musk, it's actually a building block to supply chain expansion from China to India. And I think Modi is eager to build more manufacturing capacity, and he knows very well why India is still not competitive enough to get more of the China plus one from China. So economically, I see enough pressure from within and outside of India that there could be in the next few years, some potential positive development between two countries. Yeah. So I'm not as pessimistic as Alicia about China-India relation.
Good. So Douglas, you have the last word.
Yeah, quick points on each of those. I spent a lot of time in India, and I think it's a really interesting story and development path to see. I think the Chinese-India prickliness, it may soften a little bit, but it's never going away. This is something that is deeply, deeply embedded on both sides. But more business, I think we could see this, and that would be a good thing. Now, from the standpoint of BRICS, the challenge is exactly this, that China, India, plus Indonesia and Brazil, and Saudi and maybe some others, all see themselves as the natural leaders of the global South. And this is the real challenge. And what we're seeing with India in particular, but a number of the others, are actually increasing efforts paralleling some of, say, the Chinese experiments in building alternative networks through Belt and Road or otherwise of their own. And so this is something that I think is going to be very interesting to see. And I think from the standpoint of BRICS, the challenge, as Alicia said, is going to be, will it fracture, or will it largely remain at a very high level only? From the standpoint of sustainable finance, and this was a conversation Christine and I were having just before, it's an area where we should have another forum to speak about exactly this. BRICS are a challenge because, once again, you have some very different interests of major participants from the energy standpoint, from the environmental standpoint, and from the biodiversity standpoint. And this is going to make any sort of agreement through that forum challenging. And so I think as we think about these sorts of pieces, it's often going to be the politics of the BRICS that are going to be a challenge.
Well, I won't attempt to summarize because there were so many interesting and complex points. But please join me in thanking the panel, and then I want to hand it back to Alex.
just want to thank all our wonderful speakers, Heiwai, Alicia, and Douglas, and Christine. Thank you. As I was listening to the talk, it's not just speakers that are coming from abroad that Asia Society Hong Kong brings to you. It's people like these four speakers. I'm going to allow them to enjoy their dessert, which very well deserved. It's just Asia Society Hong Kong. Many of you, in fact, today, before the program started, David had brought a book that he wrote, and he already did a program for Asia Society in France. It's many of our members, like yourself, your network, and I get approached by members and all the time, and our professors and so on. So will you be interested in programs like this? And I often said, let's talk, and we will explore, and we will usually do the program. And this is one of the reasons that Asia Society Hong Kong is very special. I think Christine had a very interesting point. I think things are happening as we speak. And in fact, I don't know about you guys, but every time I watch the news, my blood pressure goes up. And so I stopped watching the news. And I stopped watching the news regularly about 8 years ago. We know what happened 8 years ago. But what I do find myself, is programs like this. After hearing from these speakers, from the experts, it's not always rosy pictures. It's not always assuring, full of assurance, but at least I know I can decide for myself what is real, what's not. And I'm not getting it from Twitter or X or whatever, but I'm getting it directly from these eminent and these speakers who know what they're talking about. You may disagree with them, you may agree with them, regardless. So that's why for those of you, I know we also have students and scholars here. If you have ideas, please let us know. Holly's there, myself, and we would love to hear and love to do more programs like this. So like I said, the speaker doesn't necessarily have to come from Europe, US, or outside of Hong Kong. We have some of these speakers here, and they're all our friends, members of Asia Society Hong Kong. So on that note, I want to thank you all for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you at Asia Society Hong Kong anytime, whether for exhibitions or for programs like this. And again, thank you so much for your support. And thank you again, Christine. Have a great afternoon.